This video is brought to you by Incogni. Ever since he came to power in 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron has been obsessed with the idea of European strategic autonomy. This isn't a new idea, and many of Macron's predecessors have warned about what the French perceive as Europe's over-reliance on the US. But it's had a bit of a comeback in the past few months as political dysfunction in the US threatens to undermine America's support for Ukraine, and the chaos sweeping the Middle East reminds European leaders about their different attitudes to the region. So, in this video, we're going to explain what strategic autonomy is, why Macron is so keen on it, and why it's making a bit of a comeback at the moment. So, let's start by explaining what strategic autonomy is. Strategic autonomy was first mentioned as a concept during a discussion between European Council members in December 2013, and it's since become one of French President Emmanuel Macron's favourite talking points. When Macron talks about strategic autonomy, he's basically saying that Europe, or at least the EU, should be more independent in security and foreign policy terms from the US. This idea has a long history, especially in French politics, and numerous French presidents going all the way back to Charles de Gaulle have tried to pull the rest of Europe away from America, both because they think that the presence of a larger, more powerful state like America in European decision-making undermines French autonomy, but also because they consider America to be like an unreliable ally. Unfortunately for France, this hasn't really happened. And while America and Europe might have drifted apart a bit since the end of the Cold War, Europe is still, in many ways, reliant on America for its security. This is fundamentally for a couple of reasons. For starters, Germany and the UK were both pretty keen on butting up to America because the UK considered an expression of the so-called special relationship, and Germany saw NATO as a good way of guaranteeing its security while avoiding the expensive and politically difficult task of investing in the German army. This became especially apparent in the early 2010s when the European debt crisis and the austerity that followed meant that many European countries had to reduce defence spending to below the NATO target of 2% of GDP. This is another reason that much of Europe has resisted France's calls for strategic autonomy. They don't want to spend the required amount on defence and would instead prefer to essentially free ride on America's massive military via NATO. In other words, they prefer to spend less money on defence, safe in the knowledge that, if anyone did invade Europe, NATO's Article 5 would oblige America's massive military to intervene on their behalf. Macron, unsurprisingly, doesn't like this because he thinks that it makes Europe dependent on America as a security guarantor and therefore obliged to support America's foreign policy, even if it isn't necessarily in Europe's strategic interest, which is one of the reasons he attacked NATO for being, quote, brain dead back in 2019. Now, strategic autonomy enjoyed a bit of a resurgence after the election of Donald Trump because many European leaders didn't consider Trump a reliable security partner for understandable reasons. Trump had attacked Europe in the past for not spending enough on defence, promising at various points in his presidency to cut America's NATO contributions. And European leaders were also worried that Trump's aggressive and impulsive foreign policy could end up dragging Europe into a war they didn't necessarily want. Accordingly, in 2016, strategic autonomy was included in the European Union Global Strategy Doctrine for the first time, and it was cited in official EU documents as one of the reasons behind the European Defence Fund when it was created in 2017. However, Joe Biden's election in 2020 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of last year put strategic autonomy back in its box. Unlike Trump, Biden is both pro-NATO and pro-Europe, and the Biden administration's unwavering and generous support for Ukraine proved to the rest of Europe quite how instrumental America still is for European security. European states also lack the fiscal space to make the required defence investments to protect against Russia, having borrowed significant amounts over the pandemic. However, in the past few months or so, strategic autonomy has been making a bit of a comeback, in part due to France's ascendancy within the EU. For context, historically, the three big players in the EU, or rather Europe, have been France, Germany and the UK. But with the UK gone and Germany's shine waning, Macron has been able to exercise even more influence over EU strategy. Germany's influence has been waning both because incumbent German Chancellor Olaf Scholz just doesn't have the political heft that his predecessor Merkel did, and because he's fallen out with most of the other big players in the EU. Scholz currently has disagreements with Italy over migration, France over energy, and Poland over, well, just about everything. Germany's political decline within the EU has given France more sway over policy, allowing Macron to push harder on strategic autonomy without German resistance. Another reason strategic autonomy is making a bit of a comeback is the political dysfunction currently afflicting the US House of Representatives, which has already held up billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine. The battle for the House speakership is a stark reminder to Europe that not only is the Republican Party not a reliable European ally, but that even if they're not in the White House, isolationist Republicans can still undermine Ukraine's cause. Ukraine also validates the idea of strategic autonomy because at the moment it looks like Ukraine is going to join the EU but not necessarily NATO. This is a reversal of the historical pattern. Other Eastern European states like Poland and the Baltics either join NATO first and then the EU, or both blocks simultaneously. If the EU wants to take in Ukraine without a NATO security guarantee, then it will have to develop an independent defence policy to guarantee Ukraine's security and thus the integrity of the single market, if and when Ukraine does join. What's going on in Israel could further Macron's cause, because the EU and US have conspicuously different attitudes to the Middle East. Due to its geographical proximity, the EU is more focused on maintaining stability in the region, while the US, or at least some American politicians, are generally more tolerant of instability if it advances their wider geopolitical ends. This has created an uncomfortable asymmetry in transatlantic relations. The US has more influence in the Middle East, but is geographically insulated from its political instability, while Europe has much less influence, but is far more exposed to the negative externalities, including terrorism and refugees. These differences in attitude were laid bare under Trump. European leaders were furious when Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, and the EU criticised the US after Trump decided to move the US embassy to Jerusalem, a de facto recognition of Israel's claim to the city. While Biden has criticised the current Israeli government, he's generally pretty pro-Israel, which is why he hasn't moved the embassy back to Tel Aviv. If the war in Israel continues or expands, the EU and the US might diverge again, furthering the case for strategic autonomy.
A couple of years ago, Jack was the victim of identity theft, and he only found this out when he got a court letter saying that he owed money to a broadcast company for an address that he'd never lived at. Now, he's not alone either, with victims of data breaches rising by 41.5% in 2022. That data is then very often being added to commercial databases, with data brokers potentially aggregating your personal information, including your names and aliases, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and much more. All of which is available for purchase by businesses and could fall into the hands of criminals. Fortunately, Incogni are here to help. Incogni reach out to data brokers on your behalf, request your data's removal, and deals with any objections. Plus, as brokers often continue collecting data even after takedown requests, Incogni continues to keep watch. So whenever a new record pops up on a data broker site, Incogni will automatically take care of it. Even if you're not concerned about your data being stolen, we all deal with endless junk mail and robocallers, both issues that Incogni services can help cut down. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.